You know, I made that 100 Days in Hardcore Subnautica video almost 2 years ago now, and I think it's about time to give that video the sequel it deserves. So today, I'm going to be trying to survive 100 days in the frozen world of Subnautica Below Zero. During this time, I've also set myself 5 goals to make things a little more interesting. Number 1. I have to fully complete Below Zero's main and secondary storylines. Number 2. I have to gather enough resources to build myself a megabase with everything I could ever possibly need. Number 3. I have to collect the 8 music discs scattered around the map. Number 4. I have to collect and hatch one of every creature egg. And number 5. I have to descend all the way to the bottom of the void and live to tell the tale. Can I do all of this in 100 days without dying once? Well, there's only one way to find out. Day 1. I got inside of my small ship and headed for the planet's surface, using a meteor storm to help hide myself from any Altera surveillance. This might not have been the best idea though, as my ship hit one of the meteors, detaching my drop pod and causing me to spiral out of control. Luckily I was able to land safely and got out just before the ship exploded. Before heading to the drop pod though, I decided to search the debris, as any supplies I got now would be stuff I just wouldn't have to worry about later on. After getting everything I could find, I made my way through the narrow pass and jumped into the water for the very first time. My first order of business was getting to the drop pod, which would offer me basic storage and access to a fabricator. But even on the way there, I couldn't turn down the chance to do a little resource collection. I broke a few outcrops and gathered some ribbon plants, which I could use to make batteries later on. Eventually, I made it to the drop pod and used the fabricator to cook some food and make myself a scanner. I was then notified that a supply cache had been detected nearby, and decided it would be a good idea to check that out. On the way, I was incredibly lucky to find all 3 sea glide fragments, which made up for the cache itself being nothing special. I got back to the drop pod and took a moment to admire one of my favorite parts about Below Zero, which is just how darn pretty this game is. Finally, I went out to the Arctic kelp forest to grab some creepvine and used the resulting lubricant to craft a sea glide. Day 2. I crafted a knife and wanted to make an O2 tank. To do that, I needed some fiber mesh, so it was back out to the Arctic kelp forest for me. Thankfully, the sea glide made the trip much easier, and I was able to get some more resources while I was there. I then came back and made the O2 tank, giving me an extra 30 seconds of air. With a sea glide and an O2 tank, I felt a little more confident to start searching deeper, so I decided to check out the Arctic kelp caves in hope of finding some better fragments. The first cave I searched didn't really have much, but the second one was a lot better. There were some crash fish that tried to ruin my day. Might have to reconsider my feelings on not totally hating them, but I was able to get some fragments, including the mobile vehicle bay. Before I went back to the drop pod, I decided to have one more look around, and the caves gave me some gold as a parting gift. I then went back and listened to some of the voice logs while making a compass and an air bladder. With nothing much else to do, it was back to the Arctic kelp caves. On the edges of the twisty bridges, though, I heard what sounded like a distress call, and my suspicions were confirmed when I scanned an artifact that gave me its location. It was still a bit too deep for me to explore, though, so I grabbed some table coral and called it a day. Day 3. I came home, made some food, and a new battery for my sea glide, since the old one was almost dead. I went back to the twisty bridges and found my first sea truck fragment, along with a few PDAs. I raided another Altera cache before heading back to make another battery and a waterproof locker. With my inventory clean, I returned to the twisty bridges and decided to explore a very deep foundation. My risk paid off and I found a data box with the blueprint for the rebreather. I already had most of the stuff to make it on hand, so I decided to just do that when I got home. With no more oxygen penalty for going below 100 meters, I now felt I was ready to explore the distress call. Day 4. I decided to make today all about the twisty bridges. With the aid of my new rebreather, I began exploring, and eventually made my way to the distress signal. From there, I followed the green pillars into an underground alien sanctuary. A voice beckoned me to move forward, and while I can't say I'd do this in real life, I obliged. I learned that whatever was in this green cube needed to find a new home fast, lest the facility's power run out and it get deleted. Being a courteous individual who definitely doesn't put rocks and snowballs before throwing them at innocent second graders, I offered my PDA as temporary storage. But apparently that wasn't good enough, because he decided to just laser himself into my brain instead. After recovering from that ordeal, the voice in my head introduced himself as Alan, a precursor who got separated from his network around 1,000 years ago after the Kra broke out. He could get himself out of my head if I made him a new body, but given my lack of resources and his lack of knowing where anything remotely useful was, neither of us were really in a position to make that happen at the moment, so I just left the cave and sort of carried on with my life. In my exploring, I found a small abandoned base, which gave me the blueprints for the habitat builder and an upgraded O2 tank. I then headed home, had another conversation with Alan, and began some upgrades. One of these was the habitat builder, which allowed me to start working on a small temporary base. Not only would the base itself use up some materials, but I could fill the inside with lockers to help alleviate my storage issues. Day 5. I finished getting the materials for a fabricator and battery charger before moving all my stuff into the new base. At last, it finally felt like I was getting situated. I then headed off towards the Delta Station dock. While I wasn't collecting any materials to save inventory space, I did keep a lookout for sea truck fragments, and was eventually able to find the other two. I then arrived at the dock and started scanning stuff. But as I started to make my way further up, I got an ominous message from a woman who didn't seem to take kindly to my existence.
This is a recorded message. If you can hear this, you're trespassing. If you know what's good for you, you'll get the hell out of here.
I dealt with this situation like I deal with all my problems, which meant I ignored her and kept exploring. I found some crystalline sulfur in a few caves, before the same lady jump-scared me in a souped-up prawn suit. After telling me to go away again, she left, but I was able to track her last known location. I'd worry about that later, though, as I was almost at the top of the island. Once I was there, I reached the Delta Station, and began scanning literally everything in sight. The sun began to go down, and I regretted having not made a flashlight, but I was still able to get everything from the base and check out the communications tower before the day's end. Day 6. I started back down the island, but didn't head directly for the dock. I knew there was a cave somewhere on the island that had a lot of gold, and I wanted to collect some before leaving. It took a minute, but eventually I found the cave, mined up some gold, and made my way back down. I got the location of an alien artifact and began collecting stuff for the modification station, repair tool, flashlight, and sea truck. I made the repair tool and flashlight, but didn't have quite enough for the mobile vehicle bay, so I headed back out again. While I was trying to get a piece of quartz, I got wedged under an iceberg, which made me really glad the devs added an unstuck button. Once I got free, I made it back to the base, and in the stormy, dying minutes of Day 6, I made my sea truck. Day 7. The only thing I still needed to make a modification station was a diamond, so I headed down to the deep twisty bridges to get some. I reached my sea truck's depth limit, so I had to leave it at 150 meters and swim down the rest of the way. I initially grabbed some diamonds near the upper reaches before venturing into the main chasm. I definitely got a bit overconfident though, as I wasn't really paying attention and got cornered and almost swallowed by a squid shark. But besides one other minor scare with a spiky trap, it went pretty well. I pushed deep into the cave and was able to find some diamonds, gel sacks, and the odd piece of lithium. While I wasn't planning to get them at the time, I also scanned the blueprints for the sea truck fabricator and storage modules. Then I made my way back to the sea truck, repaired it, and got the heck out of there. When I came home, I made the modification station, and I wrapped up the day by collecting some more materials and scanning the odd thing or two. Day 8. I decided to make some story progression and began searching for the alien artifact. On the way there, I found another Altera cache from which I promptly stole, and was able to get the blueprint for the Pathfinder tool. I then made my way down into the Arctic kelp caves. It was here that I got the blueprint for the laser cutter, before eventually finding the artifact at the very bottom of the cave. While it was definitely a bit uneasy being this far into a cave without a vehicle, there ended up being enough oxygen plants that I was never in too much danger. On my way out, I even found the blueprint for the propulsion cannon, which I decided I'd make after realizing how cheap it was. So once I got home, I made it, alongside a laser cutter and a Pathfinder tool. Day 9. I was looking to do some more exploration, and luckily there was another Altera site nearby. So I traveled out towards the Delta Island in search of the Copa mining site. I circled around the outside of the island, eventually finding a large hole leading down to the mine's entrance. The gate was a bit too narrow for my sea truck, so I left it outside and made my way in. I found a data box with the blueprint for the moon pool before descending into the heart of the mine. I managed to get the blueprint for the thermal plant and even found 3 of the 4 prawn suit fragments. There was also a locked supply crate, but since I'd left my laser cutter at home for some reason, I couldn't get whatever was inside. As I pushed deeper though, I began to get a little nervous. There were oxygen plants, but not nearly as many as I was expecting. Nevertheless, I reached the bottom of the mine and made my way back out with around 30 seconds of oxygen to spare. I came back home and tried to make the first depth module for my sea truck, but I was still missing 1 lithium for the plasteel ingot, so I shelved that idea for now. Day 10. I was beginning to outgrow my starter base, so I started looking for somewhere to set up a more permanent shop. I found a spot close to the Delta Island that I liked, but I forgot to bring a beacon, so I left my sea truck there as a marker and swam back to get some resources. I came back and started building, but eventually ran out again, so back to the drop pod I went. I repeated the cycle once more, but eventually ran completely out of supplies, so most of the rest of the day was just spent on resource collection. Finally, as I was storing some items in the base, Alan found the location of another artifact. Day 11. I decided to go ahead and look for the artifact since it wasn't super far away. It was somewhere under the thermal spires, and while I tried to search the small fissures, I quickly realized just how bad of an idea that was, as I ran out of first aid kits and could easily get burned to death. So I decided to put a pin in that idea for now. Instead, I headed around the Delta Island into the purple vents and collected up some lithium for reinforcements. I then went back to base, crafted up some glass, and resumed construction. I got the hull integrity back over 1 and started adding in some solar panels. Day 12. I collected stuff for the rest of the solar panels, building 6 in total. I then repaired all the holes and the water began to drain out. There was still a lot of work to do, but with power and a fabricator, I could at least work on transferring the remaining stuff over. I began work on the storage room, went out to collect some more titanium, and found another Altera cache literally within viewing distance of my base. This one was better than the rest though, as it allowed me to get the blueprint for the outdoor grow bed. Day 13. I collected some more stuff for the base and began to work on sorting out the storage situation. After that, it was back out for another resource grind. You know, it's funny that after you get the blueprint for something, you seem to find tons of fragments for that thing, because it seemed like I was getting sea truck fragments all over the place. After that, I went back, built a couple of grow beds, and started moving the rest of my stuff out of the drop pod. Day 14. I finished bringing everything over and planted some creepvine, ribbon plants, and gel sacks in the outdoor grow beds. I added a vehicle upgrade console to the moon pool and crafted a heads-up display chip for my scanner room, so I could actually see where all my resources are. I docked my sea truck and gave it what I thought was a very fitting name, along with a brand new paint job. Day 15, I started working on the other half of the base. The first things to be added were a bed and a jukebox. At the moment, I only had the one default song, but that would certainly change. I built up a few more decorations, and at last, the place was starting to feel like home. I went out and grabbed some fish for the aquarium before deciding to take another run at that artifact. As I was about to leave, Alan found the location of yet another artifact, but I decided to just focus on getting the other one first. I followed the signal and ended up finding the artifact in a small offshoot of the Copa mining site, which was the other place I thought it might be. I came back home and made an observatory to round out the day, before getting to sleep in my own bed for the first time in 2 weeks. Day 16. I crafted some water, then set out towards the pilot's last known signal in hopes of finding my estranged friend. I also made a mental note to check out the other artifact if I got a chance. I found a fragment of the Mercury 2, would definitely have to come back for that later, and made my way into the lily pads. However, I was definitely pushing the limits of what I could do with my current equipment. Since my sea truck could only go down 150 meters, I had to dive the rest of the way and just kind of hope there would be enough oxygen plants for me. Initially, I didn't find much other than a couple of fragments, but as I pushed deeper, I eventually made it down to a large sea base. Here, the owner introduced herself as Marguerite Maida, a Mongolian emissary who had been living on the planet ever since her ship crashed 12 years ago. She wanted to get Altera off her back, and offered me information about my sister in exchange for disabling the communications tower on Delta Island. And with no one else on the planet to turn to, I agreed. I scanned everything I could, getting the blueprint for the test override module amongst some other things. I also managed to pick up the Sea Truck perimeter defense module, which would be very useful going forward. I then made my way back up to the Sea Truck and equipped my fancy new upgrade. And since I was already in the area, I decided to search the sea monkey nests for the Sea Truck horsepower and afterburner upgrades. I found some useful fragments and some less useful fragments, but ultimately my equipment wasn't quite up to the job, so as night fell, I made my way back home. Day 17. I arrived home early in the morning and decided to dedicate much of the day to making upgrades. I got the materials for and crafted the depth module MK1 and afterburner, increasing my speed and doubling my crush depth. I then made my way out towards the next artifact, which, if it was the one I thought it was, then I definitely was going to need that perimeter defense module. My suspicions were correct, and I carefully made my way past the Chelicerate into the hole where the artifact was. I scanned it, and this gave Alan enough information to find the location of the first body part. I was gonna leave, but decided to just go ahead and get it since it was so close. The signal took me into the deep lily pads cave, but without any nearby oxygen plants, I wasn't going to be able to get that body part quite yet. So I decided to search the nearby caves with the hope of getting some of the blueprints I still wanted. Day 18. I continued searching and eventually found the Omega Lab. While it wasn't on my immediate to-do list, it was still a good find, and I was able to get several useful blueprints. I learned that this is where Altera conducted research on the Kara, but at the time I think I was more excited about finally getting plant pots. With half of my Sea Truck's power remaining, I kept searching, because I really wanted to get the blueprint for the ultra-high capacity oxygen tank. It took most of the day, but I eventually found what I was looking for. Then I made my way home, only to realize I never turned off the scanner room, and I spent most of the rest of the night just sorting materials. Day 19. I used the scanner room to get some lithium and made the ultra-high capacity O2 tank. Then I got some lunch and looked to make the Sea Truck depth module MK2. The recipe was relatively simple, but the synthetic fibers required spiral plant clippings, and I only knew of one place to get those. So I made my way around the Delta Island until I saw the water start to get a bit more purple than normal. This was the edge of the tree spires, and from there I descended into the heart of the biome. I made my way inside one of the massive vent gardens, an oddly tranquil place given the chaos outside, and harvested spiral plants to my heart's content. I then made my way back home and crafted the depth module MK2. This brought my Sea Truck's crush depth up to 650 meters, more than enough to get the alien body part. Day 20. I set back out towards the deep lily pads cave, and this time I was actually able to take my Sea Truck all the way down there. I grabbed some of the flowering spores as I knew they were useful in benzene, and headed downward. After getting lost for a couple minutes, I eventually found the alien sanctuary. I scanned the skeleton and got the first of the 3 required blueprints. I then made my way back out, went home, ate some fish, and went to bed. Day 21. I headed out towards the next artifact, which took me to the glacial bay. I stepped out onto dry land and for the first time was forced to really contend with the cold. I tried to get the artifact, but the bridge leading over to it was damaged. I could fix it with some hydraulic fluid, which I could make pretty easily, but I'd still need to go all the way back home to do so. So while I was already in the area, I decided to try and explore a bit of the glacial bay. I picked up a signal for the Phi Robotics Center, which I followed, eventually leading me to the base. I got the blueprint for the spy pangling before making my way inside. Here I got some more blueprints, posters, as well as information on the bacterium experiments. I wanted to explore further, but it was dark and my inventory was full, so I decided to just head back to base. Day 22. I crafted a spy pangling remote, and hydraulic fluid, before setting off back toward the glacial bay. I repaired the bridge, but for some reason I couldn't quite find the artifact, and hearing the distant roars of an ice worm, I didn't want to push too far into the Arctic spires. So I went back, thinking maybe I missed the passage around the glacial basin. I also wanted to try and get some snowstalker fur to make a cold suit, but this is when I realized I'd made a huge mistake. I'd forgotten to bring any flares, which were used to deter snowstalkers, so when one started to attack me, I had no choice but to run. I left the cave and headed what I thought was back the way I came, but in the confusion, I'd unknowingly gone the wrong way and was actually pushing further into the biome. To make matters worse, the sun was going down and a storm had started, causing my heat to go down even faster than normal. I realized the gravity of my situation and tried not to panic. If all else failed, there was a nearby crevice I could jump down into to warm up. When I did start to panic was when I tried to use my backup plan, only to learn I couldn't actually fit through the hole. I realized my only chance of survival was going back to the cave I came from, but I didn't have enough heat to make it back. Just as I was only a few seconds from death, I remembered I'd picked up a few fevered peppers in a cave earlier on. I ate them and they gave me just enough heat to make it back to the cave. I decided to hole up in there for the night, and now in relative safety, was able to use my spy pangling to get 4 pieces of snowstalker fur, which would be enough for a full cold suit. Day 23. Just happy to be alive, I waited for the sun to rise and made my way out of the cave and back down towards the water. I figured out where the alien artifact was and realized I could have easily gotten to it from the water this whole time. After scanning that, I went back home, and the very first thing I did was make a cold suit, so something like what happened last night could hopefully never happen again. I decided my next order of business would be to explore that fragment of the Mercury 2 that I'd found a few days prior. To help out with that, I wanted to make the sea truck storage and fabricator modules, so I spent some time getting all the resources, retrieved my mobile vehicle bay from the drop pod, and made the 2 modules. Day 24. After docking my sea truck, my fabricator module got bugged and wouldn't connect to anything for some reason. It then proceeded to explode when I lightly tapped it, which was kind of annoying, but I pressed on. I connected up the storage module and made my way out to the stern of the Mercury 2. I found an entrance and began exploring the ship. I got some useful materials, metal salvage, and 2 of the 3 fragments for the parallel processing unit. I spent the rest of the day searching the ship from top to bottom as I tried to find the entrance to one final room. Day 25. I kept searching and eventually found my way into the room, receiving a PDA, nutrient block, water, and titanium ingot for my troubles. I then got back in my sea truck and made my way over to the bow section. This part was much larger and guarded by some squid sharks, so I made sure to be extra cautious in my approach. I entered through the prawn bay and found the final blueprint for the prawn suit drill arm. Then I got the blueprint for the reinforced dive suit as well as the alien containment unit. I made my way up onto the bridge, collecting my first music disc and scanning the final fragment in the parallel processing unit. I decided to keep exploring and was rewarded when I found a supply crate with Chinese potatoes. Eventually, though, I got what I felt like was everything important and went back to my sea truck. Day 26. Since it was so close, I decided to continue my expedition by checking out a nearby artifact. I scanned it and Alan pointed me in the direction of the next body part. It was somewhere in the Arctic spires, which I wasn't quite ready to explore, but it was still good to know. I kept poking around and found a small Altericite. This wasn't the most useful, but I did get the blueprint for the booster tank, along with some uraninite. I then made my way back home and began unloading equipment. After sorting everything out, I filled the hole on my crafting wall by building a recyclotron, which will let me deconstruct most things into their base components. Day 27. I wanted to rebuild the Sea Truck fabricator module, and while I was at it, I decided to go ahead and make the reinforced dive suit and parallel processing unit as well. I went out to collect some lead before making the latter 2 items at the fabricator. I then used the MVB to make the fabricator module and stowed some useful equipment inside. My next mission would be to head over to the Delta Island and disable the satellite tower. And since this was my first time ever using it, I decided to test out my new cold suit as well. I reached the island, and while the weather was by no means bad, the difference in temperature reduction was definitely noticeable, which meant exploring the glacial bay and Arctic spires would now be a lot easier. I made my way up to the tower, only to be reminded that the parallel processing unit is just an ingredient in the test override module, which was the part I actually needed. So I begrudgingly swam back to base, made the module, and came back. Day 28. I made my way back up the island towards the communications tower, and... Did I seriously leave it in my sea truck? Okay, back down the island to my sea truck, then back up to actually turn off the tower. I plugged in the module, and that sent the tower into test mode, broadcasting the all clear to anyone who might be tuning in. I got a call from Marguerite, who offered to meet me in her greenhouse, and I decided to take her up on the offer. The greenhouse was about 1 kilometer east up on an iceberg, so I got back in my sea truck and headed for the east iceberg zone. I arrived and found what I thought was the right iceberg and began my ascent. It wasn't the right one, but although I couldn't see it, I apparently found another artifact while I was up there, so that was nice. I then swam over to the next iceberg and found oversized bones and light sticks, a much better sign. I made my way up to the greenhouse, spoke to Marguerite, and got myself a couple PDAs along with marble melons and a couple more blueprints. Day 29. I decided to poke around the bottom of the icebergs to see what I could find, but the tunnels I chose didn't really go anywhere. While I was there, though, Alan did find the location of another artifact, so I decided to explore that. While I was on the way, I found the third section of the Mercury 2. It was by far the smallest and took me all of 45 seconds to explore, but I did get some resources and another music disc for my troubles. The signal led me down into the deep purple vents, which was good as it was an area I'd been meaning to explore. I scanned a fragment for the sea truck docking module and found the artifact. It didn't seem to lead to much, but I did unlock the blueprint for the ion battery, so that was pretty useful. I kept exploring since I really wanted that docking module, and after almost driving straight into the crystal caves, I found the last fragment. Day 30 was all about crafting. I gathered some materials and made the sea truck docking module. However, this wouldn't be any good without a prawn suit to actually dock, so I started getting the resources to build one. This took a little bit since I had to go out and get some more lithium and lead, but eventually I had everything I needed. Day 31, I made the prawn suit, but a prawn just by itself isn't very useful, so I set out to give this thing the upgrades it deserved. I made a drill and a grapple arm before getting some glass to make a depth module. Once I was done, I still had one piece of lithium left over, and since I didn't have any other upgrades, I decided to just put it towards a storage module. Day 32. I wanted to test out all of my new fancy equipment, so I loaded up my prawn suit and headed around to the other side of Delta Island. On the edge of the tree spires, I used the new drill arm to mine up some copper and titanium. I also made sure to get a decent amount of quartz, since I was always seeming to run low. I did have a bit of a run-in with a chelicerate, but we were able to peacefully settle our differences and move on. Then I went back home and sorted out all my newfound riches. Day 33. With all of my sea truck modules, that trip had taken a pretty long time, so I headed out to the deep lily pads to try and find the last fragment for the sea truck horsepower upgrade. I made my way down into the caves before realizing I hadn't actually gone to see Marguerite since visiting her in her greenhouse. Now that her pet snowstalker wasn't blocking the doorway, I was able to explore the rest of the base and get a couple more blueprints. I left and kept searching for the upgrade, but for whatever reason, the Subnautica gods just weren't on my side. I even revisited the Omega Lab and found myself just circling the entire biome with no luck. But I pressed on, and just as the light was starting to break on day 34, I found an unscanned sea monkey nest with the fragment I was looking for. I then proceeded to find another fragment almost immediately after, because as we've already established, that's just how Subnautica works. As great as it was, though, I did need to get home. I was fresh out of water, and spamming my sea truck's afterburner was not doing my power any favors. Eventually, I made it back and crafted the horsepower upgrade, making my sea truck ever so slightly more nimble. I then docked my prawn suit, giving it a cool color and a new name, before catching some bladderfish, turning them into water, and going to bed. Day 35. I decided to take things in a different direction and work on another one of my goals. I knew there was a music disc somewhere in the purple vents, so I decided to try and find it. I first made my way into the deep purple vents, thinking that's where the disc was. I found a fragment for the Sea Truck sleeper module, which I completely forgot existed up until this point, along with another alien artifact. From this, Alan figured out that one of the body parts was very deep and surrounded by crystals, which meant it was more than likely in the crystal caves. I continued on, scanning the 2 remaining sleeper fragments, before eventually finding the disc back up on the surface. I then headed next door to try and find another disc in the sparse Arctic. As I was going along the glacier wall, though, I found an opening, and realized it was the entrance to Outpost Zero, the last of Alterra's 4 main bases. I wasn't planning to look for it this early, but I wasn't just going to pass it by either. I made my way out of the water and was almost forced to turn back due to a storm. My cold suit was still in the storage module back home. But as I rested by a thermal lily, I saw the base in the distance and made a run for it. I got inside as night fell and began exploring the facility. I got the multi-purpose room glass dome, some lantern fruit, but most importantly, several PDAs. One from Sam confirmed that she planned to neutralize the bacterium, and that an antidote had been stashed in a cave not far from the site. Day 36. I left the base and followed a light stick path off to the left. It brought me to an architect facility, which admittedly wasn't super useful at the moment. I made my way out, seemingly as the weather got bad once again, ran down the frozen river and back into the water. I did keep looking around for the disc, and it wasn't long before I found it. It was at a site I'd already explored, so I must have just missed it while I was there. I then made my way back home and sorted out all my stuff. After that, I decided I should probably start preparing for the Crystal Caves. So I cut some leaves off my Preston plants and combined them with fevered peppers to make spicy fruit salad, arguably the best food in the game. And just in case that wasn't enough, I caught a few fish that I could always cook in a pinch. Day 37. I set out for the Crystal Caves, but only got around 200 meters before realizing I forgot to bring any extra power cells. So I went back home to remedy that issue and set out for real a couple minutes later. I made my way down to Marguerite's base, but this time I wasn't stopping to say hi. I continued on and tenaciously entered the purple cavern. I made a beacon to mark the way out before I got too far in and then kept going. I was looking to mine some of the large kyanite deposits, but I quickly hit the depth limit for my sea truck and realized my prawn suit wasn't going to be able to go much farther. So I removed the drill arm and started grabbing the small kyanite pieces from the relative safety of my prawn. I also scanned a couple of propulsion cannon arms, but at this point I think that's the last thing anyone cares about. I got a bit more kyanite and transferred everything back to the sea truck, then I headed for the exit, just happy that nothing had gone wrong. Luckily, the sea truck perimeter defense is absolutely overpowered, and I was able to make my way out safely. Day 38. Although I now had plenty of kyanite, the crafting recipes for both the next sea truck and prawn suit depth modules also included nickel. I had hoped to just grab some in the Crystal Caves, but I wasn't actually able to find any down there, so I decided to head back to the only place I'd gotten it so far, which was the Deep Lily Pads cave. Even so, the small gray rock was pretty hard to spot at first. A smart person might have just used the mineral detector, but my last 2 brain cells didn't think of that at the time, so I was stuck with my good old-fashioned eyeballs. I started getting harassed by a squid shark, so I did something I don't do all that often and really gave him a piece of my mind. After resolving that issue, I kept looking for nickel, which I actually started to get pretty good at spotting. I gathered enough for both depth modules alongside a couple extra and headed back to my sea truck. I made it back home, unloaded all my goodies, and set to making the depth modules. This maxed out my vehicle's crush depths at 1,000 and 1,100 meters respectively. Day 39. With my sea truck mostly recharged, I prepared to head back to the Crystal Caves and hopefully find the next body part. I snaked my way back into the caves and went deeper than I'd ever gone before. Eventually, Alan said we were close, and I made my way into the Crystal Castle. I followed a path into the facility and was able to scan the Architect organs, which left me with just 1 body part remaining. I had another run-in with a Shadow Leviathan on the way out, but the rest of the trip was without issue. Day 40. Since I had just done a lot of exploration, I wanted to take a break and work on something a bit different. Since one of my goals was to hatch every single creature egg, I thought it'd be cool to have a dedicated base where I could keep all the creatures. So I spent the day getting some resources to build a new base. Day 41. With materials in hand, I set out to build the new base. Normally my next thought would be finding a good location, but I already knew right where I wanted to build this thing. I learned a little over a year ago that you can actually build inside of the vent gardens, but I'd never actually gotten a chance to try it out in a playthrough. So once I had everything I needed, I took my seed truck and headed straight for the tree spires. You can't actually start building from inside the vent garden, so I started building the base up from the ground nearby. Once I got high enough, I was able to start building inside, but then I ran into a bit of a problem. You see, to have enough space for all the creatures once they hatched, I was going to need a decent amount of aquarium space. My plan was to just build 2 alien containments inside of a large room, but it took me all of 10 seconds to realize that wasn't going to happen. So I shifted gears and tried making a base with multi-purpose rooms, but I was still having a really hard time getting something with enough space that didn't look completely terrible. Day 42. I continued my battle within the confines of the vent garden for most of the day, but eventually I was forced to accept that there just wasn't enough room for what I wanted to do. However, I still wanted to build something here, so I came up with another idea. The tree spires is one of the most resource-rich biomes in the entire game, and being right in the center of the biome, a base here would be a great spot for a scanner room. So I modified the design a bit, went back home to grab some table coral, and added in the scanner room. Day 43. With the outside done, I went in and started adding in all the decor. I decided to power the base with the bioreactor, and I planted some fevered peppers so I could top it off whenever I dropped by. Finally, I added in a few other decorations and got the place how I liked it. Day 44. I headed back home and sorted all the extra stuff into its respective places. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, the outpost took most of my resources, so this didn't take too long. Now ready for some more exploring, I decided it was time to go to the Arctic Spires and find the last body part, so that's what I began gearing up to do. I made a few water purification tablets and grabbed some food. For transportation, my plan was to use the prawn suit, since it would provide me with warmth, shelter, and a decent amount of extra storage. Speaking of which, I had one more upgrade slot in my prawn suit that wasn't really doing anything, so I added in one more storage module and put some of my extra stuff inside. I decided to only tow the docking module to the glacial basin to save time, so with not much else to do, I connected up my sea truck and went to bed. Day 45. I made my way over to the glacial bay, found a small ledge, and took my prawn suit onto dry land. I crossed the bridge into the Arctic Spires, and was very glad I didn't have to worry about freezing in the whiteout conditions. I made my way through one of the narrow passes and found a small mining site. From there, I explored one of the iceworm tunnels, which, while tight, was just large enough for the prawn to fit through. I kept going, finding a couple more supply crates, before running into a massive supply of ion cubes that I promptly mined. I pushed on as the sun went down and ran into some snowstalkers, which again made me very glad to be in a vehicle. Day 46, I found another alien facility. This one had a teleporter, which, given my newfound abundance of ion cubes, I promptly activated. I went through and it connected me to the base over by Phi Robotics, which was pretty cool. I went back through and explored a path off to the back left. There was a weird elevator, and at the bottom was an Altera setup where I found Take the Dive, another jukebox disc, and my personal favorite. There was also a dock above a tunnel that seemed to connect back to the glacial bay, but I didn't really have the equipment to explore it right now. So I went back up to my prawn suit and rejoiced at the nice clear weather, which lasted all of 5 seconds. I kept going, getting a message that I was getting close, and eventually I reached the end of the clearing and made my way down into a tunnel. Here I found the mining site with the final body part. After scanning it, I mined up some more ion cubes and prepared to leave. I made my way back down to the glacial bay, but since I was already in the area, I decided to try and locate the frozen Leviathan site that Sam had mentioned. I hopped the gap between the Arctic Spires and Glacial Bay and made my way over to Phi Robotics. Day 47. Once the light started to come back, I began my search. I started by looking to the right of the facility, but all I found was another entrance to the water. I then went left and made my way into the heart of the glacial basin. I found a dock in the middle of a large clearing, and since it was one of the things on my map, I used it as a frame of reference while I explored. I started searching some caves, and one of them turned out to be a snowstalker den. I got to pet one of the babies, but eventually its parents showed up and I had to leave. Just as the sun was going down, I found the entrance to the glacial forest, which I knew from my map was the right spot. I found the radio tower and made my way into the cave to the left. To the right path, I found Parvin's bunker, the home of the site's former security guard. There were a few posters, but for now I couldn't take them since my inventory was already full. Day 48. I left the bunker and made my way into the frozen Leviathan cave. I found Sam's necklace and began scanning the frozen creature. I poked around a bit and found a couple of PDAs and an injection device, but without the antidote there wasn't really all that much for me to do, so I left and began searching the spy pangolin caves for the antidote. The first one I found didn't really have a whole lot, but I kept looking, finding another spot that also had a whole lot of nothing. But the third cave was different. Past the winding bridge was a supply crate with the Kara antidote. There was also some magnetite at the bottom of the cave, so I ended up having to send the spy pangolin back in for a second time. I got attacked by a snow stalker while I was doing this, but with my prawn suit right there, I was able to take care of it pretty easily. Day 49. With the antidote procured, I began to make my way back to the frozen Leviathan cave. Luckily, the area around the cave was illuminated pretty well, so I was able to find my way back without issue. I made my way up the elevator, inserted the antidote, and injected it into the frozen Leviathan, killing Altera's Karas specimen once and for all. On my way out, I made sure to grab the 2 posters from Parvin's bunker, since I wasn't sure if I'd be coming back. But at last, it was time to start heading to my sea truck. Fortunately, the prawn suit is really fast on land if you know where you're going, so I got back in no time and began to make for home. On the way, I got another call from Alan. With all the blueprints found, I could begin building him a new body. To do that, I needed to reach the fabricator base, which according to Alan was someplace very deep, and there was only one biome below the crystal caves. So as soon as I got home, I grabbed some gear and prepared to leave yet again. Day 50. I was about to leave when I remembered I actually had to get the resources to build the body, so I pinned all 3 recipes and got to work. The tissues were relatively easy. I grabbed some root pustules from the deep kelp caves and everything else I already had on hand. The skeleton was next, and that also wasn't too bad. Finally, ribbon plants alongside some kyanite and a spare ion cube were enough to make the organs. I had everything I needed, so I connected up my sea truck, docked my prawn, and set out toward the crystal caves. I wasn't 100% sure where I needed to go from there, but I knew that down was probably the right direction, so I tried doing that whenever possible. Eventually, the purple crystals turned a deep red, marking my arrival at the Fabricator Caverns. I continued down, past another Shadow Leviathan, before eventually making it to the entrance of the base. Real quick, apparently only around 4% of my viewers are actually subscribed, so if you're enjoying the videos so far, please consider subscribing. It helps out more than you might think. Day 51. After praying that I wasn't about to get my head taken off by a recently electrocuted Shadow Leviathan, I left my sea truck and made a beeline for the base's entrance. I used the 3 fabricators, and not long after, Alan had himself a new body. But before we could leave, he still had some work to do, which was good because I also had plenty of stuff left to do. I made my way back to the sea truck and began the trek back to the Crystal Caves. Instead of immediately looking for the exit, however, I began looking for small fissures in the ground. You see, I wanted to make ion batteries and power cells now that I had the ion cubes, and to do that I'd need a bunch of silver and gold. Luckily, these are the 2 ores that the Crystal Cave fissures have in abundance, so when I got down there, I was able to get all the gold and silver that I'd hopefully ever need. I then got back in my sea truck, went home, and transferred all that gold and silver before going to bed. Day 52. After vibing to the jukebox for a bit, I decided to work on the ion technology. Apparently, ion batteries in Below Zero also need lithium, which I did not remember, so I took my sea truck and set out to the purple vents, where I spent the rest of the day collecting lithium and trying not to become chelicerate food. Day 53. After sufficiently stripping the purple vents of rare earth metals, I made my way back home. I then spent most of the day crafting enough ion batteries so that I could have power cells for both of my vehicles and batteries for my 5 main tools. I also made one more upgrade, using some of the magnetite I'd collected to make range modules for my scanner room, upping its scan radius from 3 to 500 meters. Day 54. With the story nearly wrapped up, I decided it'd be a good time to start working on the megabase. So I grabbed my sea truck and started looking around for a good location. I eventually narrowed it down to either a spot in the purple vents or the lily pads. The spot in the purple vents was a bit more convenient, while I slightly preferred the lily pads as a biome overall. After thinking it over for a bit, I decided to go with the spot in the purple vents. The convenience was good as I still had to do some stuff in other parts of the map, and it was shallow enough that I'd be able to use solar panels. Day 55. It was time to start collecting materials for the base, and what better place to start than the literal mining site that was just next door. I made my way in and mined up the titanium deposits before heading deeper. I also scanned fragments whenever I could, netting myself the extra 2 titanium. I started mining at the bottom of the site, but my inventory filled up pretty quickly, so I had to head back up. While I would have been able to just store everything in a Cyclops, my storage options in the sea truck were a bit more limited. To help alleviate this issue, I crafted the titanium into ingots. Since I could deconstruct them later at a recyclotron, this essentially allowed me to store 5 times as much titanium in a single locker. I made my way back in and kept mining, but after 4 to 5 more veins, I was full yet again, so I made my way back up and repeated the process. After that, I decided to go back down and mine some copper, but I ended up finding a couple more titanium veins, so I mined those and then worked on the copper. Eventually, I got everything I wanted, but it had pretty much taken the entire day, and I wondered if there was a way to speed things up. Luckily, I remembered that there was. So after condensing all the copper on day 57, I went back home and made a second prawn suit drill arm. I then grabbed some titanium and headed over to the future build site. Rather than bringing all the stuff home and having to just transfer it later, I decided to build a temporary storage base near the edge of the build site. It was very bare bones, not even having power, but it served as a good place to dump materials for the base. After offloading everything, I made my way to the vent garden outpost. I got the power back on, set the scanner room to quartz, and got to work. I mined plenty of quartz, which was now much faster that I had 2 drill arms, but I also took the chance to get some copper and titanium whenever I saw it. Day 59. I kept going and eventually made it to one of the fragments of the Mercury 2. I filled my inventory with metal salvage and headed back to the sea truck for more compacting. At this point, most of my storage was full, but I decided to swap out quartz for titanium in the scanner room and do one more round of mining. Day 60. With my storage full, I turned off the scanner room and went back to the temporary base. Here, I dropped off everything before heading right back to the vent garden outpost. On the way there, I passed another Mercury 2 fragment and decided to salvage some more of the scrap. After that, I made it back to the outpost and began getting the more miscellaneous stuff like lithium and rubies. I also got jump scared by a squid shark, which, not gonna lie, I did not see coming this far in the run. Day 61. I filled my inventory with lithium, but after storing it away, I decided to go back down and get a little more before heading back. Once that was done, I went back to the temporary base and added in a solar panel, which was honestly less about getting power and more about being able to see what the heck I was doing. After storing everything away, the only major material I was missing was lead, so I went back to my starter base where I knew I could get some. I docked my sea truck and went to go turn on the scanner room, but since my base was trying to charge the ion power cells in my sea truck and run a scanner room while my solar panels were getting no sunlight, the power ran out pretty fast, and I had no choice but to wait for the sun to rise. Day 62. While it was still dark, I decided to try and start getting lead manually, but this was pretty slow, so as soon as the power came back on, I turned on the scanner room and got to work. Now, you might be wondering why I'm choosing to get lead from outcrops instead of just mining it, and the answer is I don't really have a choice. From the original Subnautica to Below Zero, there were a few changes made to resource distribution. One of these changes was removing the large deposits of lead, lithium, and uraninite. To compensate, the latter two can be found, quite commonly I might add, as regular materials throughout the map. But for some reason, lead didn't get this treatment. And to make matters worse, the enameled glass recipe was changed to include lead, meaning you need even more of it in this game than the first. And with literally no other options, you're kinda just forced to break Galena outcrops for the 50% chance of getting lead, which is really time consuming. So much so that it took nearly the entire day to get enough lead for just a few glass domes. Day 63. I headed back to the temporary base and built a recyclotron so I could start turning all those ingots back into regular titanium. I then started lining up the moon pool. This took a little bit since I wanted to make sure I got it right, but after a while I built it, added in some large rooms, and started working on the main structure of the base. Day 64, I kept working on the main part of the base. I found a design I was happy with and started working to mirror it on the other side. Eventually, I finished the main portion with a scanner and control room. Then I added in some hatches so I could actually get in and out of the thing, and started building some foundations around the bottom. Day 65. I finished building the foundations, but at this point I was getting pretty annoyed, since my temporary resource base ended up being pretty far from where I was actually building. So I decided to transfer everything over to a much closer base. This ended up taking pretty much the whole day, but as the sun set, I was able to get all of the resources over. Day 66. I went back to my starter base to grab some seeds along with a few other materials. I was already running low on glass, so I wanted to do some mining, but before I did, I wanted to plant some seeds in the temporary base so that I'd have a supply of food and water when I came back. So I transferred the remaining stuff out of the seed truck, planted some melons and fevered peppers, and made my way back to the vent garden outpost to do a little more mining. Day 67. I came back to my seed truck, compacted the quartz into glass, and headed right back out to gather more. I could tell I was starting to exhaust most of the nearby outcrops, but I was eventually able to get another full inventory. After storing that, I went down to look for some diamonds, and headed over to the thermal spires to nab a few more pieces of lead. Day 68. I turned off the scanner room and headed back to the new base. I dropped everything off and proceeded to make my hull integrity even worse by building some glass roofs. At this point, I was getting close to having the outside done, but I still wanted some observatories, which meant, you guessed it, more enameled glass. Also, it turns out I didn't grab enough diamonds from the tree spires, and I was gonna run out of lead soon anyways, so I went back to the starter base for lead and prayed that I still had some diamonds. Fortunately, my prayers with the diamonds were answered, and I spent the rest of the day mining up lead. Day 69. I decided it was time to finally get rid of all those hull integrity warnings, so I added in the final 4 foundations, and then began the juggling act between adding windows and trying to keep the base from flooding. A few reinforcements later, I was able to get the hull integrity back into the positives, which meant it was time to start adding windows until everything broke again. Day 70. With the outside work more or less done, I decided to head in and work on repairing those 50,000 hull breaches. This took almost a third of the day, but eventually I got that beautiful message that the base was starting to drain. With that out of the way, I turned my attention to how I was going to go about powering this monstrosity. I eventually settled on using 8 solar panels with 2 nuclear reactors in reserve. Day 71. I built the nuclear reactors, finally giving the base an appropriate amount of power, and meaning I'd never have to worry about energy ever again. I then recycled some titanium and began working on the rest of the inside. When building, I usually like to start working on the largest areas first, so I began work on the storage room at the center of the base. This was also good since it meant I could just start storing everything in the actual base instead of having to go back and forth between the temporary one. Day 72. I kept working on the storage room, but ended up running completely out of titanium. At this point, it was starting to dawn on me just how long this base was going to take, but I pressed on. I stowed away some items and once again set out for the vent garden outpost. I passed the same Mercury 2 fragment from earlier and decided to grab all the scrap I'd missed. After clearing out the area, I made it to the outpost. This time, titanium was the name of the game, and luckily, unlike the quartz, it was still relatively abundant. I ended up getting harassed by a couple of chelicerates, but other than that, I was able to mine to my heart's content for the rest of the day. Day 73. I kept mining for a bit, but even the titanium was starting to run low, so I mined up what was left and headed back to base. Now that the base had power, I was able to use my sea truck dock for the very first time, and I've gotta say, I ended up liking it way more than I thought I would. I kinda thought it would just be similar to the moon pool, but being able to go in and access everything without having to leave the base was really nice. After that, I took out some of the titanium and began working on the area directly below the storage room. Day 74. I went out and started collecting a bunch of quartz with my scanner room. I used it to make some glass and was able to finish off the area below the storage room. With the two biggest rooms now more or less done, I was able to start decorating some of the smaller rooms. Of these, my first priority was the moon pool. I added in some windows, which I'd somehow forgotten to do, and installed some chargers, along with a vehicle upgrade console for good measure. Day 75, I started work on the 6 remaining multi-purpose rooms. To keep things a bit more organized, I decided to turn the half of the base with the reactors and scanner room into the more work-focused side, with the remaining 2 rooms becoming an office and a greenhouse. I worked on these rooms for the rest of the day, eventually getting designs for both that I was happy with. Day 76, I worked on decorating the 2 reactor rooms. This was a bit tricky since most of the space was already taken up by the reactors, but by the end of the day, I had both rooms looking the way I wanted. Day 77. I moved on over to the other half of the base, and my first priority was building myself the best bedroom this side of the cosmos. I put in an alien containment unit in the room below, which gave most of the room a really cool glass floor, and I made sure to outfit it with all the things I'd want in real life, like a fully stocked minibar, another jukebox, because I couldn't possibly be expected to walk 30 feet every time I wanted to change the music, and a bench to look out at the big blue emptiness. Day 78. With all that done, I moved on to the last 2 multi-purpose rooms. I decided to turn the first one into a small galley, but as I was building the kitchenette, I realized I never actually got the blueprint for the sink. So I did what any reasonable person would do and immediately headed down to Marguerite's base to remedy the issue. With the sink acquired, I came back home and kept working on the galley, adding in some chairs and an aquarium in the middle. I started working on the bathroom, and some people might point to trivial things like an absolute lack of any privacy whatsoever, but to that I say, the only other person on this planet is even more reclusive than I am, so I'm not really worried. Day 79. With most of the inside done, I started working on some of the smaller connecting tunnels and observatories. One of the last things I wanted to add were some bulkheads, which needed silicone rubber, so I went back to my starter base to craft some. I was also thinking about adding in a couple more foundations, so I set the scanner room to look for lead. While that was doing its thing, I raided all the pictures, posters, and other trinkets and put them in my sea truck. After that, it was time for yet another Galena mining session. After filling up my inventory with enough lead to make the residents of Flint, Michigan jealous, I went back up to my scanner room and stole the 4 range modules for my new base. Day 80. I arrived back home and got to work. I added in some chairs to the observatories and went to grab some table coral for a modification station. With that created, I added in all of the bulkheads, which helped separate the various sections, and meant that in the event of a leak, the flooding could at least theoretically be contained to one area. Day 81. I added some benches to the corridor sections, but once again ran out of titanium. I was able to skim a little more by deconstructing some lockers in the temporary base, but I realized I was going to need to go on one more mining trip. With the titanium around the Vent Garden outpost mostly used up, I instead made my way to the East Iceberg Zone. Luckily, I hadn't mined here yet, so even though most of the area ended up being out of my scanner room's range, I was still able to find a bunch of titanium pretty easily. After getting what I hoped would be my last titanium of the challenge, I went back home and finished building all of the benches. Day 82. I decided to go through with my plan and add a few more foundations to the base. This was less of a need for hull integrity and more so just somewhere I could put more grow beds. However, it did end up adding enough strength that I was able to remove 4 reinforcements, so that was kinda nice. Then I built all the exterior grow beds and started planting some creepvine, since it gives off a really nice glow when it's fully grown. It was gonna take a little bit for that to happen though, so I started working on the interior plant pots. Day 83. I went around the base and started figuring out what plants I wanted to go where. And once that was done, I used all the plants I'd grown in the temporary base to start seeding all the pots and grow beds. Day 84. Now that the first batch of creepvine had matured, I was able to get enough seeds for the rest of the grow beds. After that, it was back to the interior gardening. I made good progress, and after a while, I had pretty much every pot and grow bed filled, except for the ones with horseshoe shrubs, since those seem to grow pretty slowly. I needed to add some more outdoor plants, but the spiral plants that I wanted to add next were also growing pretty slowly, so I went to the vent garden to get more seeds. I ended up destroying almost every spiral plant, but it got me the seeds I was looking for, so I was willing to ignore any environmental complications. Before I left, I also grabbed some redwort seeds because they're one of the few purely decorational plants that you can actually grow. Day 85, I kept working on the outdoor grow beds. For some of the plants, instead of just waiting for them to grow and harvesting the seeds over and over, I used the trick where you hit a plant just enough times for it to not disappear, pick it up, put it back down, and repeat. Doing this, I got enough seeds for the ribbon plants and young cotton anemone. Next on the list was antenna plants, but those were going to take a bit longer. So while I was waiting for them to grow, I decided to start labeling everything in the storage room. With that done, I was finally able to move everything from the temporary base to its proper home. Day 86, I started to shift my focus. With the base and story nearly done, I still had 3 more goals I needed to finish before day 100. So after taking a couple of minutes to get rid of the temporary base and empty out my sea truck, I set my sights on getting every creature egg. To begin my search, I made up some food and headed out to the lily pad islands. I didn't find much at first, but after going into one of the caves, I found the lily paddler egg. I then made my way onto one of the floating islands, which let me pick off the glow whale egg. That was it for the lily pads, but 2 more eggs were right next door in the deep lily pads cave, so that's where I went. With no parent to guard it, the squid shark egg was pretty easy to get, and after making a couple of wrong turns, I was able to get my hands on one of the coveted golden trivalve eggs. Day 87, I made my way out of the cave and back home. Most of the remaining eggs were more towards the western half of the map, but there were still 2 more that I could snag pretty close by. So I crossed into the thermal spires, made my way into one of the small fissures, and was able to get the Cryptosuchus egg. Next, I made my way over to the Copa mining site, and at the very bottom, I laid claim to a rock puncher egg. I then went to the kelp forest to search for the penguin and sea monkey eggs, and I was eventually able to find the latter next to an ion cube. Day 88. I don't know what kind of deal the penguins made with evolution to get such well-hidden eggs, but they must have offered a lot, because I couldn't find the dang things anywhere. I spent half of the day just getting confused by grav trap fragments, because those things look far too much like eggs at first glance. While I was searching though, I inadvertently made my way into the sparse Arctic and found the Arctic ray egg, so it wasn't all bad. But I still needed that penguin egg, so I decided to use the scanner room at my starter base to see if that could help. The results were a bit mixed. I found the brute shark egg, but I was never super concerned with that one to begin with, and other than that, the game seemed to give me every egg but the ones I needed. Day 89. My luck began to turn though when the scanner room picked up on a crashfish egg. Not long after, I figured out why I was having so much trouble with the penguin egg. Penguins, I realized, are like birds, meaning they lay their eggs on, land. After that basic biology lesson, I found a brinewing egg frozen to one of the glaciers and set out in search of the glacial connection. This winding subbiome connects the glacial basin to the West Arctic, and it's the home of the eye jelly. Fortunately, the eggs were pretty easy to find, which was a nice change of pace after everything I'd been through. Unfortunately, since I have roughly the same cognitive prowess as a baby worm, I got lost about 5 feet from the exit, although I did manage to snag some magnetite, so that was good. Then I made my way into the West Iceberg Zone to begin looking for the final 2 eggs. I found the Titan Wholefish egg pretty quickly, but the blue trivalve proved to be a bit more elusive. It was up on an iceberg, but since the only way onto that iceberg was across a large gap, I was going to need to go back and get my prawn suit. Day 90. I came back and docked my prawn suit on the sea truck before heading right back out to the iceberg. I found a ledge to climb up on, and while it turns out I was actually on the wrong iceberg, I was able to find the right one pretty quickly, netting me the 16th and final creature egg. I docked back up with my sea truck and went over to my starter base to turn off the scanner room and grab my cold suit. Before I left the twisty bridges, I also managed to get a couple more seeds to decorate with once I got back. Day 91. I took all of my newfound creature eggs and added them into the aquarium. I was pretty sure that the main tank had enough room that nothing would die from overcrowding, but just in case, I decided to put the trivalves and a couple other eggs in the tank below my bedroom. While I waited for those to hatch, I headed over to the Lilipad Islands. There were still 2 more plants that I wanted to grow outside, and apparently both of them grew here. I ended up finding one of them, but struck out with the other, so I headed back and spent the rest of the day planting. Day 92. Just as I was wrapping up, a bunch of my creature eggs started hatching. I took a quick break to look at them and can now confidently say that baby sea monkeys are the cutest things in the known universe. Then I went out to the thermal spires to see if I could find the seeds for that final plant. Ultimately, I wasn't able to find any, and with my days beginning to dwindle, I decided to just cut my losses and go home. When I got back, I collected the ingredients for spicy fruit salad and water purification tablets, as it was time to work on completing my final 2 objectives. I put my cold suit in the prawn, charged up a couple of extra batteries, and left my base for what I hoped would not be the last time. Day 93. I passed through the tranquil beauty of the glacial bay and made my way onto land. Before I'd left, I had gone through my jukebox to find out what discs I'd been missing. There were 3 of them and they were all in land, so it made sense to just get them all in one fell swoop. Right away, I found the first disc that I'd apparently overlooked. Now I just had to get the other 2. One of them was at Phi, and since I had a beacon pointing me directly there, I decided to get that one next. Sure enough, the disc was just sitting there on a bed and I'd somehow managed to miss it when I first came through. Last but not least was the third disc, which was in Parvin's bunker. I made my way into the glacial forest, entered the cave, and got the final disc, crossing off another one of my objectives. I made my way back to the glacial bay, but instead of going to my sea truck, I turned left and headed up the bridge to the Arctic Spires. Why am I doing that? Well, it's time to talk about that 5th goal of mine. For those of you who don't know, the void in Subnautica isn't actually infinite. If you manage to reach a depth of 8,192 meters, you'll be teleported back to the center of the map. And doing this isn't actually all that difficult. I've personally done it, and so have a lot of other people. All you've really got to do is just hop in a prawn suit, jump in the void, and swim the last couple hundred meters after it breaks. There's just one catch. Everything I've said up until now only applies to the first game. To my knowledge, no one has ever reached the bottom of the void in Below Zero, and there's a very simple reason why. You see, there was a lot of Subnautica stuff that got small tweaks in Below Zero, and the prawn suit was one such thing. In what was probably intended as a quality of life improvement, the prawn suit got changed so that it wouldn't fall super quickly. But as a result, the prawn suit in Below Zero can only go around 800 meters below its crush depth before blowing up. And that's if you even make it that far. Since you fall so slow, you can't outrun the void chelicerates, meaning you'll probably die long before the crush depth even becomes an issue. So how then was I planning to do this? Well, there was 2 main problems that I had to solve. The first of which were the chelicerates. There was simply no way I was going to make it all the way down there with 3 of them hounding me, so I needed a way to remove them from the equation. And luckily, I had just the way to do it. I recently learned that there are actually 2 types of void in Below Zero. Water void is the one most people are familiar with. It surrounds the southern and eastern sides of the map and has the 3 void chelicerates. But there's also a second, lesser-known biome called tundra void. It mostly exists under the land biomes, but unlike the water void, it doesn't spawn in anything, making it the ideal spot to do my dive. As for the prawn suit itself, its slow speed is actually a bit of a blessing in disguise. With a sea glide, you can actually swim underneath it as it's falling, let it land on you, and repair its health back to full. Combine this with the tundra void, and getting to the bottom in one piece was at least theoretically possible. But actually doing this in-game was another story. To reach the tundra void, I was going to need to get out of bounds, which is why I was going to the Arctic Spires. There are 2 ways you can get out of bounds here. You can staircase your way up with base pieces, or you can just fling yourself around with a prawn suit and hope to get lucky, which is the method I went with. I made my way up and started heading towards the back of the map. I was looking for a specific spot that would give me access to the tundra void, but I'd never actually gone there before, so while I knew the general area, I didn't have a route planned out. I began my journey, but as the weather began to turn, I made a big mistake. I thought I knew the area well enough to keep going, so despite the nearly whiteout conditions, I forged on. The weather momentarily cleared, but then the sun started to go down, making my visibility even worse. Day 94. I carried on in the darkness, looking for the drop-off, but I must have missed a turn somewhere because I was faced with a sheer cliff blocking my way. That's when I made my second mistake. Instead of just circling back around, I tried to force my way over the wall with the grapple arm. But the thing with being out of bounds is that things like terrain don't always work the way they're supposed to. I hadn't had any issues so far, but my luck had just about run out. I got wedged in the corner of the two walls and fell through the ground, landing about 50 meters down in a small gap that was just barely wide enough to move. There was no way I was going to be able to climb back up, so my only option was to move forward. And I was at the complete mercy of the terrain. At any moment, there could be a wall in front of me, completely trapping me in. But for now, it was just a small crevice, extending as far as the eye could see. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made it to the end, and thankfully there was no invisible wall trapping me. But as fast as my hopes were lifted, they sank once more. It turns out that the water I had just blindly jumped into was not the safe tundra void, but regular water void. At any moment, the chelicerates would start attacking me and I'd be good as gone. So I made a mad dash to the left, hoping to find the area I'd originally been looking for, but I realized that just wasn't going to happen. I then took another look at what biome I was in and got a glimmer of hope. While most of the area I was in was regular void, there was a tiny sliver next to the wall that was still considered tundra void. I realized that if I could just get under this giant wall, I'd be well within the tundra void, and while it wasn't where I planned to start my dive, it would still work as well as any other spot. So, against my better judgment, I let go from the wall and let myself fall. Then I found the bottom of the wall and made my way under the map. Now free from the void chelicerates, I began my descent. I passed 1100 meters and my prawn suit's health began to drop, and once it reached half health, I got out to test my strategy. Sure enough, I was able to swim under the prawn and repair it without it falling. I got back in and repeated this process. But for whatever reason, after passing 3000 meters, it just stopped falling whenever I got out, which made repairing a lot easier. Day 95. I passed 4100 meters, marking the halfway point of my journey. But staying there wasn't going to do me any good, so I pressed on. It took several more repairs, but 5, 6, and 7,000 meters eventually came and went. At 8100 meters, I got out and put down a beacon. While I would soon be gone, it would serve as a reminder of just how far I'd traveled. Then I hopped back in, rode down the final 92 meters, and got teleported back to the twisty bridges, marking the completion of yet another goal. But before I could go home and celebrate, I still had to go back to the glacial bay and grab my sea truck. On my way over, perhaps as a present for reaching my goal, I found the last plant I was looking for, so I grabbed a few seeds, got in my sea truck, and headed back home. Day 96 was honestly a pretty chill day. I did accidentally blow up another storage module when I was trying to connect my sea truck, but at this point it didn't really matter. I spent pretty much the entire day working on the base, first planting the final outdoor seeds, then moving inside and displaying all the posters, pictures, and other knickknacks I'd found. Day 97. I still had a bunch of copper wire left over from building the base, so I decided to go through and add in a bunch of signs to make navigating the place a bit easier. Once that was done, I made one final trip over to the Vent Garden outpost to mine some more copper, as I had just one more thing I needed it for. Day 98. I decided to add some plants to the alien containments, and with literally every growable plant outside, I guess you could say I had plenty to choose from. In a similar vein, I also wanted to get some fish for the 3 smaller aquariums, so I left to go do that. I got featherfish and bladderfish from the purple vents, and then traveled over to the twisty bridges to get hoopfish and arctic peepers. I added the little guys into their new home, and as night began to fall, I used the last of my glass to add a few floodlights around the base. Day 99. One of the very last things I wanted to do was give this base the sound system it deserved, so I took all the copper I'd mined and got to work. And I've gotta say, after all the time I'd spent rushing around in the last 98 days, it felt nice to just sit back, relax, and listen to some music while I built the speakers. Then I gave the base a name, and at last, everything was finally done. There were definitely times I thought I might have been a bit too ambitious with my plans, but in the end, I was able to finish everything. I spent the dying hours of the day just admiring the base. Even though it's a bit laggy, it's definitely my favorite one I've ever made, and with that, I did something I hadn't actually done up until this point, and slept the first and last night in my fully finished base. Day 100. I woke up, got in my sea truck, and bid my base farewell. I followed the final waypoint, which led me up onto land, so I put on my cold suit and stepped out of the ocean for the very last time. From there, it was just a short walk past Outpost Zero up to the phase gate facility I'd found all the way back on day 36. Once I got inside, Alan activated the portal at the back of the facility, and with nothing else left to do, I stepped through. I came out on the other side of the glacier and helped Alan prepare the ship. Once that was done, we headed through the phase gate, completing my final objective and leaving this Arctic world far behind. Hey, thanks for making it to the end. If you enjoyed what you saw, consider leaving a like to help support the video, and let me know what you'd like to see next. Anyways, that's all from me for now. I hope to see you all again very soon.